So we're here at OIS at ASRS. I'm joined by Andrew Gitkin. Andrew, thanks for coming back.
Happy to be here.
You're Managing Director at Piper Jaffray. You gave a great presentation about the state of the public markets. We just wanted to kind of hit upon a couple of high points. Seeing some activity on both the IPO and the M&A front. What stands out in those two areas?
Well, I think we're continuing to see a lot of the same trends that we talked about at the last OIS. From an M&A perspective first, you continue to see a lot of activity both in the biotech side of the industry as well as for the medical device side of the industry. There were two notable deals thus far this year in medtech, specifically the Novartis acquisition of Encore Vision, as well as more recently, and I think the other day, Johnson & Johnson's announced acquisition of TearScience. So we continue to see a lot of activity in the ophthalmology segment. From a biotech perspective, a recent IPO in the ophthalmology field, and that of Kala, which was the first one in some time. Biotech tends to be a little bit more receptive to IPOs than medtech, generally speaking, and we're seeing ophthalmology biotech take advantage of that.
And there is sort of a wildfire aspect to IPO sometimes, where if one goes out, then things may start to heat up. Do you foresee that happening, you think, with Kala going out?
Well, I think broadly speaking, the biotech IPO market for the most part is healthy. As we talked about in the presentation that we just delivered, if you take a rolling average of the performance of all the IPOs in biotech since the start of 2016, I think on average they're up around 50% as a class. And by the way, you compare that to medtech, which is probably down 15% if you exclude a couple of high performers. So a stark contrast in terms of the medtech IPO product being a little bit challenged compared to the biotech product. So if there are going to be more IPOs in ophthalmology, they're undoubtedly going to likely be in biotech. The Kala deal certainly is very helpful. There was a couple of IPOs earlier this year that happened that really performed very well, that sort of opened up the IPO market in a bit more of an earnest way middle of this year and as we head into the second year. So in short, I think we're going to continue to see some IPOs. I don't actually think there's going to be an onslaught of them. It's certainly a function of the quality of the company. And as we talked about in my discussion, private ophthalmology companies tend to be acquired and exit that way versus going public. And I think that's still largely going to be the case.
And how do you see that shaping up? You talked about TearScience. That was a company that had some commercial activity to it. You're seeing earlier stage companies like Encore be acquired earlier on. Is there a profile to an acquisition target within ophthalmology, or is it really just based upon what a hot sector might be, like dry eye?
There's a couple ways of looking at it. I think there's a profile difference between what is needed to go public as a biotech company versus a medical device company. Medical device companies in some ways are held to much higher standards, rightly or wrongly, having to be commercial, not just commercially launched, but a commercially viable product. So the investment thesis is more about sales execution, commercial execution. $20+ million in revenue with 20+% growth rates. Biotech is quite different. It's more or less it's the opposite. It's about development execution, proof of concept in phase 2. So you can argue the bar is a little bit lower. So I think that's a way of distinguishing between the two types of profiles of companies that could go down either path. In terms of ophthalmology, again, I think it's some investors distinguish between front of the eye and back of the eye and have biases one way or the other. I don't think that's necessarily the only way of looking at it. I think a lot of it has to do with the technology, the market size, and the data generated to date at the time of the IPO. And if you meet those three, I think there's a good chance you can get it publicly listed.
Terrific. Well, thanks for the update and for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Great.